last week I said that I thought Trump would resign next spring. And people said, oh, that's very clever. You got a lot of pickup. You know, you like to say kind of crazy ass things and everything. I want to be very clear on something. I'm not doing this as a crazy ass prediction. I'm doing that because I genuinely think that he will resign next spring. And I'll assign my reasons. First of all, I'm not an MD. I'm not a geriatric, but I am going to be 82 this year. And his rate of decline from election day to now, it's not linear. You don't lose a quarter of a percent a month. When it goes down, it goes quickly. And you can look at him and see how just fat and unhealthy he is. Secondly, I have experience that not a lot of people have. I know what it's like to lose a massive off-year election.
What's good, people? Dr. John Podcast is back again. Congress is finally fighting back against Trump's executive overreach, reasserting its constitutional role with a ferocity that has stunned observers. After years of being bypassed and dismissed, the legislative branch is using every tool available to check presidential power. And Trump is discovering the system of checks and balances is not as fragile as he believed. The transformation that has occurred in the relationship between the executive and legislative branches represents one of the most significant political developments of Trump's second term. For years, the pattern had been consistent and unchallenged. Trump would issue an executive order, bypassing Congress entirely. Trump would declare a national emergency, unlocking funds that Congress had not appropriated. Trump would defy congressional subpoenas, refusing to provide documents that the legislative branch had demanded. Trump would veto bills that Congress had passed, daring the legislature to override his objections.
We did in 1994. It's so monumental. It's so massive. It hurts so deep. You just can't imagine it. The entire world around him is going to change after November of this year. People don't pay attention to you. They're making jokes. Everybody knows you're on a short leash. You got two years left to go. You don't have any power. Everybody around you is being subpoenaed for everything that you can imagine. Your life is miserable. He doesn't have the and Clinton came back because frankly, it was the greatest mismatch maybe in American political history, Bill Clinton versus Newt Gingrich. Well, guess what? Donald Trump is not the Bill Clinton of 1995. All right? And Hakeem and the Democratic leadership and Schumer, they're not Newt Gingrich. And he is going, and I'm doubling down on this prediction, he is just going to walk away. He's going to go to J.D. Vance.
And through all of this, Congress had largely accepted its diminished role, with Republican leaders changing rules to give Trump more discretion, Republican committee chairs refusing to hold oversight hearings, and Republican members falling in line behind whatever the president wanted. The legislative branch had become, in the eyes of many observers, a constitutional relic, a debating society that existed primarily to ratify the decisions made by the executive. But something fundamental has shifted in the political calculus of Congress. Republican members who had previously been content to follow Trump's lead on virtually every issue have begun to realize that their constituents expect more than blind loyalty to the president. The grassroots pressure that has been building across the country, the protests that have filled the streets in all 50 states, and the polling data that shows Trump's approval ratings sinking to historic lows.
And his lawyers are going to say, look, you can stay, you can pardon yourself. There's some uncertainty as to whether you can do that. There's no uncertainty as to whether a President Vance can pardon you and your family. So I'm sticking with my prediction, and it's based on something other than to try to be provocative and get people talking something. I think the son of a bitch is just going to walk away. Remember that song, Walk Away, Renee? That's what he's going to do. He's going to walk away because the pain that is coming for him, both the emotional pain and the physical deterioration, you watch it right in front of your eyes. I don't have to be a doctor to see this guy can't move. He can't get out of a chair. I know what it's like to be in the 80s. And unlike a lot of people, I know what that job is like. And it's not compatible. Maybe there's some people 80 could do that. He's not one.
Have all combined to create an environment where Republican politicians can no longer afford to be seen as mere appendages of the executive branch. The calculation has changed from one of party loyalty to one of political survival, and that change has produced a cascade of legislative rebellions that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The administration is now facing a Congress that is not just willing to push back on some issues, but is actively organizing to reassert its constitutional authority across the full range of legislative powers. The specific examples of congressional resistance are numerous and significant, each one representing a crack in the wall of executive dominance that Trump had carefully constructed.
Mentioned Democratic strategist James Carville. He's out with a bold prediction, saying that the Trump administration and Republican lawmakers will suffer a massive collapse in 30 days. Let's take a look.
What I've said very publicly, the Democrats need to play possum. This whole thing is collapsing. It doesn't need Elizabeth Warren and somebody screaming to pacify some progressive advocacy groups in Washington, which, by the way, I wish these people were just useless. They're actually worse than useless, that they're detrimental. And they never, ever learn to shut up. And so, Dan, this is what I believe. I believe that this administration, in less than 30 days, in the midst of a massive collapse, and particularly a collapse in public opinion. It's going to be easy pickings here in 6 weeks. Just lay back.
So you literally think 30 days to 6 weeks, the Trump administration is effectively going to collapse in terms of public support?
Well, it's collapsing right now.
In a single day of legislative action, the House of Representatives delivered a series of rebukes to the president that would have been impossible to imagine during the first years of Trump's presidency. Republicans voted to override Trump's veto of a Colorado water project, a direct challenge to the president's authority over spending. Republicans broke with Trump on a tribal land bill, signaling that the administration's priorities were not always aligned with the interests of the nation's indigenous communities. Republicans joined Democrats to pass a bill reviving tax credits for the Affordable Care Act, a health care program that Trump has spent years trying to dismantle. All of these votes happened on the same day. All of them were against Trump's explicit wishes.
We're in the midst of a collapse. This is the lowest approval, not even close, that any president has ever had at a comparable time. Again, that's a provable fact. So they're not going to be able to get a debt extension. That's pretty clear. I don't think they're going to be able to pass reconciliation, but I'm not sure. But they're going to have to go to Hakeem. And that is going to be the equivalent of stacking arms. It's over.
Well, that is certainly
pronouncement.
That's certainly one view of it. Again, going back to Wide World of News, Halpern also quotes from Heather Cox Richardson's newsletter, her quote of Timothy Snyder, who is a scholar on authoritarianism, who said, "Something is shifting. They are still breaking things and stealing things, and they will keep trying to break and steal, but the propaganda magic around the oligarchical coup is fading." Nervous Musk.
And all of them demonstrated that the president's control over his own party was no longer absolute. The significance of these legislative actions cannot be overstated. When Republicans vote to override a presidential veto, they are sending a message that the president's objections are not sufficient to block legislation that Congress wants to pass. When Republicans join Democrats to pass bills that the president opposes, they are signaling that their loyalty to their constituents outweighs their loyalty to the party leader. When Republicans support legislation that Trump has explicitly condemned, they are demonstrating that the president's influence over Congress is conditional rather than absolute. These votes represent a fundamental reorientation of the relationship between the executive and legislative branches, a reorientation that is likely to have lasting implications for how the government functions in the Trump era and beyond. The rebellion is not confined to the House of Representatives. In the Senate, Republicans have been supporting resolutions that constrain Trump's war powers, voting to limit the president's ability to wage military operations without congressional approval. These are not minor procedural votes or symbolic gestures. These are direct challenges to the president's authority to use military force, authority that Trump has exercised aggressively and unilaterally throughout his second term. The war powers resolutions that have been introduced and supported by Republicans represent a fundamental assertion of Congress's constitutional role in decisions about war and peace, a role that had been largely abandoned by previous Congresses in favor of executive prerogative. The fact that these resolutions are being supported by Republicans, including some of Trump's most vocal allies, indicates that the president's war policies have become a political liability that even his supporters are unwilling to embrace without congressional oversight. The willingness of Senate Republicans to constrain Trump's war powers represents a particularly significant development given the context of the Iran conflict that has dominated the administration's foreign policy agenda. Trump's military operations in Iran and Venezuela have been conducted without explicit congressional authorization, relying instead on the president's asserted authority as commander-in-chief and on previous authorizations that were never intended to cover the current conflicts. Congress has been increasingly vocal in its concerns about the scope and duration of these operations, with members from both parties questioning whether the president has exceeded his constitutional authority. The war powers resolutions that have been introduced are a direct response to these concerns, an attempt by Congress to reassert its constitutional role in decisions about military force. If these resolutions are passed and Trump refuses to comply, the resulting constitutional confrontation could be one of the most significant in American history. The discharge petition has emerged as one of the most powerful tools in Congress's arsenal against presidential overreach. This procedural mechanism allows a majority of the House to force a vote on a bill, even if the Speaker refuses to bring it to the floor. By gathering enough signatures on a discharge petition, the minority party and dissenting members of the majority can bypass the leadership and force consideration of legislation that the administration opposes. This is a nuclear option in legislative politics, a last resort that is rarely used because it represents a direct challenge to the leadership's control over the agenda. But in the current environment, with Trump's power over Congress eroding and with Republican members becoming increasingly willing to challenge the president, the discharge petition has become a weapon of choice for those seeking to reassert congressional authority. The use of discharge petitions to force votes on bills related to Epstein records and health care has been particularly notable. The Epstein records bill, which would require the release of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein's crimes and his relationships with powerful figures, has been vigorously opposed by the administration. The reasons for this opposition are unclear, but have raised significant questions about what the records might contain and why the president is so determined to keep them secret. The discharge petition on this bill has gathered enough signatures to force a vote, demonstrating that there is significant bipartisan support for transparency on this issue. Similarly, the healthcare bill reviving Affordable Care Act tax credits has been forced to a vote through the discharge petition process, despite the Speaker's reluctance to bring it to the floor. This bill has now passed with bipartisan support, providing tax credits to millions of Americans who purchase health insurance through the ACA exchanges. The Senate report on Trump's power grabs provides a comprehensive documentation of the administration's pattern of constitutional violations. Titled Undermining Constitutional Limits, the Trump administration's power grabs. This detailed report examines every significant instance in which Trump has exceeded his constitutional authority. The report documents emergency declarations that were used to bypass Congress, reprogrammed funds that were spent without legislative approval, subpoenas that were defied, and executive orders that effectively rewrote laws that Congress had passed. The report systematically lays out the pattern of executive overreach that has characterized Trump's presidency, providing a roadmap for how future presidents might be constrained and how the separation of powers might be restored. This report is not just a historical document, but a political weapon, evidence that could be used in any future impeachment proceeding against the president. The implications of this congressional resistance for the remainder of Trump's presidency are profound and far-reaching. The administration can no longer count on Congress to automatically approve its priorities or to rubber stamp its decisions. The president can no longer assume that his vetoes will be sustained or that his policy preferences will be respected. The executive branch is now operating in an environment where legislative pushback is not just possible but likely, where oversight is not just theoretical but active, and where the constitutional separation of powers is being reasserted with vigor. This changes the fundamental calculus of governance, making it much more difficult for the administration to accomplish its agenda, and much more likely that the president will face significant constraints on his authority. The administration's turmoil is not a temporary phenomenon, but a structural transformation in the relationship between the branches of government. The emergence of a bipartisan coalition willing to stand up to Trump represents one of the most significant political developments of recent years. Democrats, who have opposed Trump on virtually every issue throughout his presidency, have been joined by significant numbers of Republicans on key votes. This coalition has been able to pass legislation that the president opposes, override his vetoes, and constrain his military authority. The existence of this coalition changes the political calculus for both parties. Democrats can now count on Republican support for some of their priorities, and Republicans can now demonstrate independence from the president without facing immediate political consequences. The coalition is likely to grow as the election approaches and as more Republicans realize that their political survival depends on demonstrating independence from the increasingly unpopular president. The question of whether this congressional resistance will lead to impeachment or removal is one of the most pressing issues in American politics. Each veto override, each discharge petition, and each war powers resolution builds a record of presidential overreach that could be used to justify removal proceedings. The Senate report on Trump's power grabs provides detailed documentation of the president's constitutional violations, evidence that could be presented in an impeachment trial. The increasing willingness of Republicans to break with the president on key issues suggests that the political support for impeachment may be growing. However, the bar for removal remains high, requiring a two-thirds majority in the Senate for conviction. While the current congressional resistance represents a significant challenge to Trump's power, it does not yet represent a consensus for removal. The constitutional tools that Congress is using to push back against Trump are each significant in their own right. Veto overrides demonstrate that Congress has the power to pass legislation even when the president objects. War powers resolutions demonstrate that Congress has the authority to constrain military action. Discharge petitions demonstrate that Congress can overcome leadership opposition to force votes. Subpoenas demonstrate that Congress has the power to demand documents and testimony. The Senate report demonstrates that Congress can investigate and document executive overreach. Each of these tools has been used at various times throughout American history, but their use has been rare and often controversial. The current Congress is using all of them simultaneously, creating a comprehensive challenge to presidential authority that is without precedent in the modern era. The historical significance of this moment cannot be overstated. For the first time since the presidency of Richard Nixon, Congress is actively and aggressively asserting its constitutional authority against an executive that has sought to accumulate power. The fact that the resistance is coming from members of both parties and that it is being conducted through established constitutional mechanisms distinguishes this moment from previous eras of congressional executive conflict. The founders designed the separation of powers to function precisely in this way, with each branch protecting its own authority against encroachment by the others. The current congressional resistance represents the realization of the founders' vision, a check on executive power that has been too long dormant. The outcome of this constitutional confrontation will shape the balance of power in American government for generations to come. The administration's response to the congressional resistance has been characteristically combative. Trump has denounced the veto overrides as betrayals, attacked the war powers resolutions as treasonous, and accused the discharge petition supporters of undermining the government. The rhetoric has escalated as the resistance has grown, with Trump threatening to defy congressional subpoenas, to veto any legislation that he does not support, and to use executive action to bypass Congress entirely. However, the administration's Biden's threats have become less effective as the congressional resistance has grown. Members of Congress who were previously intimidated by Trump's threats have become emboldened by the success of their efforts and by the support they have received from their constituents. The dynamic has shifted from one of executive intimidation to one of congressional assertiveness, a shift that has changed the fundamental character of the relationship between the branches. The role of the Speaker of the House in this drama has been particularly challenging. Speaker Mike Johnson, a Trump ally, has found himself caught between the demands of the president and the desires of his members. The use of discharge petitions to force votes on bills that Johnson does not want to bring to the floor represents a direct challenge to his authority as Speaker. Johnson has attempted to maintain control over the House agenda, but the success of the discharge petitions has demonstrated that his control is not absolute. The Speaker is now in a position where he must choose between supporting the president and losing control of his chamber, or cooperating with the resistance and alienating the administration. This is an untenable position that is likely to become more difficult as the election approaches and as the pressure on Johnson to demonstrate independence from Trump increases. The international implications of the congressional resistance are also significant. America's allies, who have been concerned about Trump's unilateralism and his willingness to bypass established institutions, are watching the congressional pushback with interest. The reassertion of congressional authority demonstrates that the constitutional system is still functioning, that there are checks on presidential power even when the executive seems to be acting without constraint. This observation provides comfort to allies who have been concerned about American democracy, and it suggests that the United States may be more stable and reliable than the administration's actions would suggest. Conversely, America's adversaries, who have sought to exploit Trump's unilateralism and his conflicts with Congress, may be disappointed by the reassertion of congressional authority, which constrains the president's ability to act without constraint. The impact of the congressional resistance on the 2026 elections is likely to be significant. The midterm elections will determine whether the current congressional pushback continues or whether the balance of power shifts back in favor of the administration. If the resistance produces tangible results, if it constrains Trump's power and passes legislation that benefits constituents, then the members who have been involved in the resistance are likely to be rewarded at the polls. Conversely, if the resistance is seen as ineffective or as undermining the administration's agenda, then it may be punished. The elections will serve as a referendum on the congressional resistance, a test of whether the voters support the reassertion of congressional authority or whether they prefer a more unified government under executive control. The outcome of this test will determine the future of the separation of powers in American government. The connection between the congressional resistance and the broader protest movement that has swept the country is also worth noting. The protests that have filled the streets in all 50 states have provided political cover for Republican members who want to break with Trump. The protesters have demonstrated that there is significant opposition to the administration's agenda, and they have created an environment where opposition to Trump is politically viable. The congressional resistance is in some ways a reflection of the grassroots opposition that has been building throughout Trump's presidency, a translation of street-level anger into legislative action. The resistance and the protests are two sides of the same coin, manifestations of the same political forces that are working to constrain presidential power. The question of whether the congressional resistance will be sustained over the long term is one of the most important questions in American politics. The resistance has been fueled by a combination of factors, including the president's declining approval ratings, the protests, the legal pressures on the administration, and the electoral incentives facing individual members. If these factors continue to align, the resistance is likely to continue and even to grow. However, if the political environment shifts, if Trump's approval ratings recover, if the protests fade, or if the electoral incentives change, then the resistance could dissipate. The future of the resistance depends on the continued convergence of these factors, a convergence that is far from guaranteed. The administration is working to change the political environment, to boost Trump's approval ratings, to defuse the protests, and to change the electoral calculus facing Republican members. The outcome of this struggle will determine whether the congressional resistance is a temporary phenomenon or a lasting transformation of the relationship between the branches. The constitutional significance of the congressional resistance extends far beyond the current administration. The precedents that are being set, the tools that are being used, and the relationships that are being redefined will shape presidential-congressional relations for generations to come. If the resistance succeeds in constraining Trump's power and in reasserting congressional authority, it will establish a new baseline for the separation of powers, a baseline that future presidents will have to respect. If the resistance fails, if Trump is able to overcome the congressional pushback and to continue acting unilaterally, then the separation of powers will be weakened, and future presidents will have even less incentive to respect congressional authority. The stakes of this constitutional confrontation are enormous, affecting not just the current administration, but the entire structure of American government. The role of the courts in the congressional resistance is also significant. The Supreme Court, which has been a source of support for the administration in some cases, has also ruled against Trump on several important issues. The tariffs that the court struck down, the immigration policies that the court rejected, and the legal challenges that the court has refused to hear have all constrained the administration's ability to act unilaterally. The courts have been an important check on executive power, providing a counterbalance to the administration's assertions of authority. The congressional resistance, combined with the judicial pushback, creates a comprehensive challenge to the administration's authority, a challenge that is likely to continue as long as the president seeks to act without constraint. The media coverage of the congressional resistance has been extensive, with journalists devoting significant resources to documenting the pushback and explaining its significance. The coverage has helped to keep the issue in the public eye, ensuring that the resistance is not simply a matter of inside the Beltway maneuvering, but a visible political phenomenon. However, the media coverage has also been criticized for sensationalism, with some observers arguing that the resistance has been exaggerated or that its significance has been overstated. The tension between the need to inform the public and the impulse to dramatize events is a constant challenge for the media, and the coverage of the congressional resistance has been no exception. The media's role in shaping public perception of the resistance is significant, as the way the story is framed will influence how the public understands the situation and what conclusions they draw from it. The impact of the congressional resistance on the administration's ability to govern is profound. The administration can no longer assume that its legislative priorities will be enacted without significant modification. The administration can no longer assume that its vetoes will be sustained. The administration can no longer assume that its war powers will be unchallenged. The administration can no longer assume that its subpoena defiance will be without consequence. The congressional resistance has fundamentally changed the operating environment for the executive branch, making governance more difficult and more constrained. The administration is now forced to negotiate with Congress, to compromise on its priorities, and to accept limits on its authority. This is exactly the outcome that the founders intended when they designed the separation of powers. But it is an outcome that the administration has resisted at every turn. The political incentives driving the congressional resistance are also worth examining. For Republican members, the incentive to break with Trump has increased as the president's approval ratings have declined and as the electoral risks of being associated with him have grown. For Democratic members, the incentive to resist Trump has always been strong, but it has been reinforced by the success of the resistance and by the public support it has generated. For both parties, the resistance has become a political asset, a way to demonstrate independence and to appeal to voters who are dissatisfied with the administration. The political incentives are likely to continue to favor resistance as long as Trump's approval ratings remain low and as long as the public remains concerned about his conduct. This is a structural feature of the current political environment, one that is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. The historical comparisons that are being drawn to other eras of congressional executive conflict are instructive but limited. The congressional resistance to Trump is sometimes compared to the opposition to Richard Nixon during Watergate, to the opposition to Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction, and to the opposition to various presidents during the Vietnam War era. These comparisons provide some context for understanding the current situation, but they also highlight the uniqueness of the present moment. The current resistance is broader than the opposition to Nixon, involving not just impeachment hearings, but a comprehensive legislative challenge to executive authority. The current resistance is more bipartisan than the opposition to Johnson, involving significant numbers of Republicans as well as Democrats. The current resistance is more sustained than the opposition to Lyndon Johnson during Vietnam, involving repeated efforts across multiple policy areas. The uniqueness of the current resistance makes it difficult to predict how it will end or what its long-term consequences will be.